If you are watching this video, then you must have already used jQuery in your projects, or you are at least aware of what jQuery is. There has been a lot of years since jQuery was first released in the year 2006. If you are one of those developers who over time have become dependent on jQuery to such an extent that you cannot even imagine creating a project without it, then you should watch this video right to the very end to know that today there are so few things for which we need to include jQuery in our web applications. The reason to not use jQuery when you don't need to is simple. You will not have to include jQuery script and style references unnecessarily. Although jQuery still has its use for some things which might take a little while and complications to implement in vanilla JavaScript, but then again there are numerous polyfill functions available out there for different kinds of stuff. The JavaScript language itself has become so much self-reliant that we don't need jQuery or much of the stuff that we code using JavaScript. In this video, I will show you guys small examples in 5 different areas in which you may feel that having jQuery is an absolute requirement for cross-browser compatibility and ease of use. So without wasting any more time, let's get started with the code examples and see how easy it is to replace jQuery with pure JavaScript. But before we do that, I would like to thank all of you for taking your time to watch this video, and I really hope that you will find this video interesting and you will be able to learn something new while watching it. And if you do, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Code First channel. This will make sure that you will always remain the first person to receive news about the latest video updates. So as I talked earlier, the 5 different areas in which I will show you that you might not need jQuery are these ones. The first one is selecting DOM elements depending on various attributes like ID, class name, or maybe some attributes, etc. The second one is the AJAX calls. Third one is DOM or document object model manipulation. Fourth one are animations, and the last one is promises. These are 3 different div elements and the IDs are div content 1, div content 2 and div content 3. The first div can only be selected by using its ID. The second one can be selected using either the ID or class, and the third one also has an attribute and its value, so we can use the attribute 2 to select the third one. So let's now find out how we can select each of these div elements using JavaScript. Selecting the first div using only its ID is pretty easy. We just need to call document.querySelector and then we need to provide the ID of the div as an argument, and we also need to use a pound or hash symbol before the ID, and this will select the div element if it exists in the DOM. There is another method which can be used to get the element using its ID using JavaScript, and that is called as get element by ID, but the query selector is more standardized right now in these days, so be sure to use query selector or maybe query selector all if you think that you need to select more than one elements. We can select the second div using its class name, and we can do that by again using query selector, but then the query value is going to be the class name, and with the class name we need to use a dot like we do in jQuery, and this is how we can select any element using its class name. Now let's find out how we can select the third div which has an attribute 2. So if we want to select the third div using its class value and its attribute value, then we can again use query selector, but then we have to provide first the class name, and then inside the brackets we need to provide first the name of the attribute and then the value. We can omit the value itself and we can only keep the attribute, but if we want to select the element depending on the value of the attribute, then we need to write the query in this format, and this covers most of the scenarios or most of the ways in which we do select HTML elements inside any project. If you have any kind of very complicated or custom requirements, then you might use jQuery, but those requirements do not occur very often. The second area in which we don't need to use jQuery anymore these days is the AJAX calls, because there has been introduction of fetch API sometimes back in JavaScript. So what we can do is, if we want to fetch any data in the, let's say, JSON format, then we can use fetch API using any asynchronous function. So let's say we have a function which is called as get data, and if we have the URL of the API, then we can call fetch function in JavaScript, and then we can provide the URL as an argument. This will return us a response, and this is going to be a promise. So we can either use asynchronous functions and await keyword to get the results, or we can use promises to fetch the results. But I guess the async or await workflow is pretty easier to understand and follow through. After we have the response, we have to write another line of code to fetch the JSON object, and that can be done by calling response.json function. This will return us the JSON object. So you see how easy it is to execute GET requests in JavaScript now. Making POST request is also very easy using the fetch API, and for that, first we need to have an options object containing the type of the request and the type of the content. Suppose that we have a JavaScript object which we need to send to the server as an argument of the POST request. Then let's first have the object. Next, we need to have an options object. This is going to have the values for the method, the headers for the content type, and if we are sending anything inside the body in the JSON format, then we can do that too. So over here, we are converting the JavaScript object in the JSON format by calling json.stringify. And then finally, we can again call the fetch API, but this time, apart from the URL of the API, we also need to provide the options object as another object for fetch API to know what method it needs to use and what are the header values, what is the body, and there are some other values that we can provide as well. But all in all, you can see that this can be done easily through JavaScript. The third one is DOM manipulation. Now I agree that jQuery is much more efficient in making very complicated DOM manipulation operations, but for simpler ones you don't need jQuery, and I will show you a very simple example how we can insert any HTML element inside another element. For this purpose, I will first create a span by calling document.createElement, and then we need to provide the name of the element, which is span, and then we can set some values of any of its properties or attributes, like HTML is being set with a value. Now to append this element into another element, let's say in any of the above divs, then we only need to call the parent element's append child function, and then we need to provide the element that we want to append as an argument for this function, and this will be enough to append this. Next one is animations, and jQuery has a lot of different features for animating the DOM elements, but CSS2 is pretty capable in creating animations, and I will show you how. We can use CSS animations to animate DOM elements in a variety of different ways. For an example, if we want to create a rotating spinner, then first we can provide the styling information for that spinner, and this information is also going to contain the animation values or animation properties, like the name of the animations, the duration, the iteration, and the timing function, along with some other values which we can provide. For the name of the animation, we need to provide another element which is going to be the keyframes element, and this is going to provide the information how the element is going to transform or change for many of the different properties that it has. It can rotate, it can move, and it can do a lot of other different things too. This is the spinner which I just created using only CSS, and it was pretty straightforward and pretty easy. Normally we would rely upon jQuery to do these simple things, but if you know how to do things without jQuery, then you are better off in not using it altogether. The last area which I will talk about, in which you don't really need to use jQuery anymore, is creating and using promises. So for example, in this function, we are returning a new promise. This promise is accepting the arguments for the resolve and reject arguments, and we can provide these values by calling .then function or .error function. The content inside the promise object's argument will execute, and depending on the outcome of the code which is being executed, we can either resolve the promise or we can either reject the promise. Using this promise function is easy. We only need to first call this function, and then this function will return the promise object which is being created over here, and then we can call the .then function of the returned promise. If it is a success, then this function will be called with the value as an argument which has been provided with the resolve function as an argument, and this is how we can easily use promises. For example, in this function, the resolve function will be called after 3 seconds. So these were 5 code examples in different areas in creating a web application in which you don't really need to use jQuery, or you know what, this is not just about jQuery. If you don't need to use any other code library too, then please don't use it, because it will add unnecessary clutter to your web application. It will be harder to maintain, it will be longer to load the web application in the browser, the network calls are going to take much longer. So it is better to only have things which you need and discard the rest. And this is what this video is all about. And with that, I will take my leave and I will see you in the next video. If you like it, then please be sure to like it and also subscribe to it. Till we meet in the next video, have a great time.